John, it's a delight to see you again. Let's set the stage for this. Some people are going to pick up this book. They're going to see the title, and they're going to think, oh boy, here we go. Another guy who doesn't like capitalism, who has a lot of criticisms of it. He even made money as CEO. He's probably feeling guilty. The fact is that you are quite a ferocious capitalist. And what is interesting to me is that you weren't necessarily born that way, but rather are somewhat of a convert. And you talk in the book about your younger life as a young man, self-described progressive. You live in a housing co-op, a food co-op. You start a business. And your views at the time, and I'll just quote you, said you embraced the ideology that business and corporations were essentially evil because they selfishly sought only profits. Then you start your business. And the next thing we know, you're reading Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and then we have Whole Foods. Talk a little bit about that conversion, what you learned from your early experience, and how you came to a point where you're now writing a book, not just calling capitalism a heroic enterprise, but talking about the ways, in fact, you want to defend it and improve it.
Well, the first thing to understand is I'm very idealistic, and of course, I'm a great believer in capitalism. I think business is heroic. It has lifted humanity up out of the dirt. And some of the statistics we discovered as we researched the book, Kim, was that a couple hundred years ago, 85% of the people alive lived on less than $1 a day, and that's in today's dollars. Today that's down to 16%. Illiteracy rates across the planet were over 90%. Today they're down to about 14%. The average lifespan was only about 30. Today it's 68, 78 in the United States, 80 in Japan. So humanity's made great progress. So we're great believers in what business has been able to do. It's actually not the villain in the tale, it's the good guy. But of course when I was starting out, I didn't, young, I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and that's a pretty progressive city, and I just sort of, I didn't study business. I studied philosophy and religion and world literature and history and pretty much the humanities. And so when I started the business, I just had no background in economics or business or anything. And but I knew that I was going to have really low prices, and I was going to pay really well, and I was going to be a different kind of business because I wasn't going to be like those other businesses. And of course, but once you get into the real world and you have to meet a payroll and you've got to pay your bills and you're undercapitalized, your philosophy of business can evolve. It was very interesting to me because a lot of my friends from the co-op movement really saw me as sort of a traitor, that I had become, gone over to the dark side. And yet the business was struggling. We managed to lose 50% of our capital in the first year. We had started with $45,000, we lost $23,000. And Renee, my girlfriend at the time, who co-founded the business with me, we were living in the store on the third floor, and we were only making $200 a month each, way below minimum wage even back then. So I just began to move away from that philosophy, and as I was trying to figure out business, I started to read. I read hundreds of business books. Everything that was available I read, and to try to understand how to make the business successful. At the same time, somehow or other, I stumbled onto people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard and Jude Wanniski and George Gilder and dozens and dozens of other thinkers. And I realized that their explanations for how the economy worked and how society worked made a heck of a lot more sense than sort of the half-baked philosophy that I'd had as a so-called progressive. And so I abandoned that philosophy. It didn't work. In the real world, it was proved to be very unsatisfactory. So that's kind of how I got started on it. And it's not so much that those economics helped me to become a better business person, so much as they just gave me a worldview that made sense of what business was actually doing and what I was doing as a business person.
So you come to capitalism, you now understand that all of these ideas like voluntary exchange, profits too, that they all not only create good businesses but help society. You were talking about the things in the beginning. What is conscious capitalism, and how does it differ from what many of us would call just plain old wonderful capitalism?
Well, first thing to understand is that we think business is good and it's created great value, but it can be better. It has greater potential than is being realized. And Kim, when you understand that, when you look at the Gallup poll, for example, that shows that big business in the United States has an approval rating of 19%. That means 81% don't approve of business. And when you see that even Congress is only is at 17%, which is about the same level, only a couple points below it, you realize that people have lost confidence in business. They don't, and the narrative about business and capitalism has really been controlled by the enemies of business and capitalism. And if you study history, you'll see that business people have always been held in disdain throughout all history. If a lot of business wasn't done by the elites were above common trade, and business was something often that fell on in the shoulders of minorities, such as in the West, Jews, and in the East, the Chinese, who through hard work and through enterprise oftentimes made a success of their lives. It made money, and that created envy and persecution. We saw the Jews run out of one country after another, supposedly because of a different religion, and certainly contributed to it, but a big part of it was that they were economically very successful, and that was disdained by the intellectuals. The intellectuals have always hated business, and we could get into why that might be the case if it's serving a useful purpose, but I think the most important thing to realize is that intellectuals are not the friends of business, and not in the past, and certainly not today. And so business is painted as fundamentally all about money. It's selfish, it's greedy, it's exploitative, and it only exists to make money. And I think it's, if you go to a cocktail party and you ask somebody randomly, what's the purpose of business? People will give you an odd look, because they'll probably say, what do you mean, what's the purpose of business? The purpose of business is to make money.
Right.
But that's an odd answer, because if you ask a doctor what their purpose is, they certainly are well compensated. They also need to make money, but they won't say, well, my purpose as a doctor is to make money. No, a doctor heals people. Teachers educate, architects design buildings, engineers construct things, journalists hopefully are helping to uncover the truth.
We try.
Yes, and they potentially have a higher purpose of discovering what's been hidden away and bringing it to light, and giving a good, interesting story that hopefully is also a truthful story. Hopefully. So the professions all refer back to some type of higher purpose that serves other people. It creates value for other people. Well, business is the greatest value creator in the world. It creates the goods and services that make our lives better. Business creates value not for a few. It's not a zero-sum game where somebody wins and somebody else loses. Business creates value for its customers, for its employees, for its suppliers, for its investors, and for the communities that it's part of. And all of that is done through voluntary exchange. So business is fundamentally good. And as we point out in the book, it has the great potential to be heroic in terms of lifting humanity up to a higher level.
And you talk about in the book about doing that by having purpose, like you said,
yes.
In terms of the example you gave of a doctor, his greater purpose. So you have purpose, you align your state. What are some of the aspects of conscious capitalism?
Well, we identify 4 key tenets of conscious capitalism. All 4 they're somewhat interdependent, so you can't just take them in isolation. They all sort of work together in a synergistic fashion. The first one we've talked about, which is business has the potential for a higher purpose beyond making money. It's not that there's anything wrong with making money, of course. That's one of the things business does that creates value for its investor stakeholders. But just as my body produces red blood cells, and if I stop producing red blood cells, I'm going to die. But the purpose of my life is not to produce red blood cells. And similarly, business cannot exist if it's not profitable. It will not have the capital it needs in order to renew itself, to innovate, to repair equipment when it wears out, to be able to respond to competition. So profit is essential to business. But every business has the potential for a more transcendent purpose beyond that, just as these other professions do. So first, business has to discover or rediscover its higher purpose. And by the way, most entrepreneurs who create businesses in the first place are motivated by some type of higher purpose. They may not be